Well, as the nation prepares to commemorate the 12th anniversary of the worst terrorist attack on U.S. soil, we find ourselves as Americans yet again at a crossroads, nearing the brink of war with a timeout underway. What have we learned in these post-9/11 years, and how has our mode of operation changed? We're going to talk with an expert in geopolitics. Dr. David Keeling is coming up. And later in the show, a Syrian American woman is going to share the story of her country, Syria, her home country, and so much more right here on Kentucky Outlook. Stay with us. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Kentucky Outlook. I'm Barbara Deeb. On the program today, we are taping this show on 9/11, on September 11th, as we commemorate 12 years ago on this day, the worst terrorist attack on U.S. soil occurred. And to kind of put that all in perspective and get a check of where we are today, we welcome to the program Dr. David Keeling, who's with WKU's Geography Department. And you're a geographer of politics, a political geographer. And so help people understand what that means.
Political geographer means that we look at relationships between political states, not necessarily their political systems, but how they interact over space and time across the planet. So why does the United States have good relationships with one country versus another, one region versus another? And so it's all wrapped up in people's, places, and political ambitions.
Well, if we take a look at what's happening in the news today, we talked about in the introduction being on the brink of war at one point, and President Obama talking about wanting to retaliate against Syria for what we now know is using chemical weapons against its own people. However, there's a timeout because we now know that there's some maneuvering going on, and maybe diplomacy might be the answer. But before we go that far, let's take a look. You know, as we mentioned, 12 years ago today, it was a day to remember, 9/11. What have we learned in that time?
We have learned over the last 12 years that, first, the United States is no longer the global hegemon. We have the most powerful military on the planet, but we have really lost our edge in terms of our economic, social, moral, political leadership. That should be a concern to the American people in many different ways. But what we've learned also is that the world has become a much more intricate set of political chess pieces, where we've got this whole set of what we like to call illiberal democracies, societies that are trying to achieve the same goals that we've achieved in the United States or parts of Europe, yet have not had that length of time or the resources, facilities to make that happen. So I think we're entering into a very, very fascinating but very dangerous period of time, very similar to what happened in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries with the Reformation, where countries are trying to figure out where they fit in this changing geopolitical chess game that is planet Earth.
But, you know, and again, now they see the potential for them to be a player, those countries that maybe previously had kept quiet, laid low. Now they see an opening?
They see an opening because they have a resource power, they have a voice. A lot of people either complain or congratulate the United Nations now for recognizing more the power of the emerging economies of the world rather than the power of the big five or big six, which is true. We've seen dramatic changes in the integration of European countries, the former Soviet bloc. We've seen dramatic changes in Africa in terms of how those countries are addressing the challenges of the modern world. So I think every single country, and we've got about 208, 209, 210, depending on whose numbers you believe, that are all jockeying for position in the global political system.
Post 9/11, we now have the NSA, the name Snowden. We have terror alerts. We look for colors to determine how afraid we should be on that day, how cautious we should be on that day. It has changed our lives tremendously in the way we deal with life.
It has. It's changed dramatically, and as someone who travels the world constantly, you see that level of concern and suspicion across the world in many different ways. And I think what really has changed society in so many ways is technology. The level of sophistication in our ability to know everything that's said, written, transcribed, transmitted is in one way very, very dangerous for countries that seek power, but also dangerous for this democracy that is trying to emerge in many parts of the world. And I think what we have to be cautious of in the United States is not overstepping our technological boundaries and infringing on the rights of other societies to develop as they wish to develop in this illiberal democratic phase of their growth.
You need to explain that more. So we have to be cautious in that regard?
We have to be careful about trying to imprint our way of doing things, our vision of a political world on societies like Egypt or Libya or Syria that are going through these very profound changes and saying, here's the best way to do it. Right? We don't have the best way to do it because each society has very different cultural norms, political values, economic resources to make that happen. And using the term illiberal democracy means that a lot of democracies are not truly liberal. Right. They're illiberal in the sense that things happen in those societies that might not meet the needs of our society, but meet the needs of that society. And we have to be more conscious of that and more respectful of allowing these political states to emerge in ways that work for them, not in ways necessarily that work for us.
And yet find our place in being able to
find our place together as a good mentor, for example, or a supporting member of the family that can help when asked, not help when not asked.
The Arab Spring, as you mentioned, we are seeing, you know, to be alive today and to see the changes that are taking place. So many affected by things that have gone on for centuries, and yet, you know, why is it coming to a head now?
We are seeing in the Middle East as a political region what is very similar to the Reformation in Europe in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, where there is a faction within the Islamic world and certainly in the political region of the Middle East that wants to move towards a more Western style of socioeconomic development. The very types of questions that were raised by proto-Protestant groups in the Middle Ages, after the 30 Years' War, for example, where different ways of running society, lending money for interest, investing in resources, etc., clashed with established hierarchical patterns of political, economic, religious systems. And I think the Middle East is starting to figure that stuff out and say there are some things that we can do like the West, there are other things that we want to do in our own way. Thus the illiberal part of trying to figure out these approaches.
And we're going to talk more about those approaches and the situation in Syria when Kentucky Outlook continues with Dr. David Keeling. Don't go away. Kentucky Outlook continues. I'm Barbara Deeb. We are talking with political geographer Dr. David Keeling. And before the break, we were talking about this post-9/11 world. And it has truly changed everything that we do profoundly. Before the break, you were talking a little bit about what's happening with what we call the Arab Spring and why now. And in particular, tell us about Syria. What's going on there and why are we at the place we're at with Syria?
Many of these countries in the Middle Eastern region, really from Morocco, Tunisia to the west all the way through to Iraq that is undergoing profound restructuring. Syria is at the heart of that process right now. The world's attention is on this area. This is all part of these restructuring challenges that societies have in the Middle East and elsewhere, where they are looking for economic and political opportunities in a changing global system. And we've seen in places like Egypt and places like Libya and now Syria that this process is not an easy one. And if we were to think back to the 1776 revolution in the United States, we'd understand that it's not easy. A lot of people die, there's a lot of destruction, and there's a lot of figuring out how to put the system back together in a way that allow you to move forward. And the Syrians are experiencing what multiple societies have experienced over the last 200, 300, 400, 500 years.
With a little bit different caveat in that it appears that the president and those in power there have used chemical weapons against their own people, which is against international law. So we're at a crossroads right now, and it appears that as we record this program, diplomacy is being looked at. Russia is now back. And I think the best analogy or metaphor, or whatever you want to call it, is a big chess game right now.
Yes.
You know, there's a lot of maneuvering, a lot of strategy going on.
See, Russia has a tremendous level of investment in the Middle East, certainly in Syria. And there are strong pressures on Russia to live up to its commitments to that part of the world. Part of it is in response to American influence, certainly American influence over Israel to some degree, and our role in Iraq and other parts of the region, our influence in Saudi Arabia. And so there is competition between these different power groups, Russia and the United States particularly, but also within the region. You've got Hezbollah, you've got the Iranians that are playing a very powerful role, you've obviously got the Israeli situation to consider. And so it's a lot more complicated than just an internal civil war for the Syrians, because there are a lot of other players in Syria that aren't part of the Syrian political system.
But chemical warfare, why?
I think this is an interesting question that we faced in other parts of the world where, personally, I'm not convinced that the Assad regime used chemical weapons in the way that it's being explained in the suburb of Ghouta around Damascus and other parts of Syria. It's a lot more complicated than what we understand in this public context of discussion. I'm sure the president and others have more detailed information that they won't release, but I just don't think it's in Assad's best interest to use chemical weapons, because he knows that that really is a red line for societies around the world doing those types of things. We went to war in Iraq over chemical weapons and yellow cake uranium or weapons of mass destruction. So he's not an idiot. He understands that actions like that are bound to bring international pressure. I personally just don't know. I'm not convinced yet by any of the evidence. It could have been Hezbollah, it could have been the Iranians doing a false flag, it could have been Assad, it could have been some Russian involvement. I just don't know.
But nonetheless, we're at this crossroads, we are at this place. And can diplomacy work here?
I think diplomacy in this case has to work, because it would be foolish of the United States to get involved in military action in Syria at this stage of the game. It would not work well in building relationships with Russia. We have very little support in the European Union. We certainly have very little support in other parts of the world. Diplomacy is the best option right now to figure out, are there chemical weapons? Who has them? How much are there? Where are they located? Right? Those are all questions we don't have answers to.
Could we have gotten to diplomacy without the threat of retaliation?
Absolutely we could have. But I think what happens when you have weapons of mass destruction arguments or chemical weapons, these are things that are so abhorrent to human beings and society generally that we tend to overreact and draw that line and say, oh, you can't do that. If you do that, this is what's going to happen to you. Right? And we have a tendency in the United States to overreact to situations because we are geographically illiterate when it comes to really understanding how these things work. And I use that not in a pejorative sense, but in the sense that even with all these smart people in Congress and the political system, we're still geographically illiterate about how the world works. Diplomacy would have been a much better option starting 2 years ago when the Civil War broke out.
And we should point out we have a Syrian American who's going to join us for the last segment of the program to kind of give us a sense about Syria and its people and its culture. But that having been said, do you anticipate a time, you know, we're talking about a post 9/11 world and how it's changed dramatically, and in a sense, very much so, we're finding our way. We're still charting the course.
Yeah.
Do you anticipate there'll come a time when we will have arrived at our destination?
Not in my lifetime, I don't think, because we're at a situation now where you have so much technology and so much interaction, and the stakes are so high in terms of who has access to resources for economic growth, who has access to territory to provide those resources, that there are so many players now in this game. It's not a bipolar Cold War world anymore. You've got 200 plus political states that all want a piece of the action. And so there are enough radical elements in society, whether they're rebel groups or terrorists, whatever you want to call them, that will continue to attempt to disrupt the global system for their own political ambitions. And so we all have to work together in a post-9/11 world to make sure that we keep everybody safe, we keep the lines of communication open, and we don't become overbearing in our attempt to protect the American people.
But as American people, how can we do a better job of that?
We can do a better job by learning more about the people that we interact with on a daily basis, by having experts out in the field trained to really understand the goals and ambitions of these new illiberal democracies, people that are fighting to survive. The reality is today that every 9 out of 10 people born on this planet in the 21st century are born into abject poverty. Right? So that's a recipe right there for crisis and chaos, because we're not addressing the underlying conditions that create those challenges to the Western world.
Where do you anticipate the next hotbed of, I want to say activity, and that activity can be any number of things, but you know, we've concentrated a lot with the Arab Spring on the Mideast, but what do you anticipate is brewing?
I've got a feeling that parts of Latin America, parts of Africa are stepping up to the brink in terms of some fundamental changes in how their political, economic, social systems are structured. You know, you may see some fairly dramatic change in Cuba within the next few years. Certainly Venezuela's undergoing some significant change. But there are a lot of countries around the world that are trying to figure this democratic post-9/11 global environment. And it's not easy. It's not easy when you live in a society that is impoverished, that is resource poor, and that is dominated by bigger powers.
And we'll leave it at that. And you know, in keeping with what you just said, learning more about other cultures, stay with us, because when we come back, Huda Melki is going to join us, a Syrian American, and enlighten us about Syria. But we've been talking with Dr. David Keeling, always a pleasure.
Thank you, Barbara, great to see you.
Political geographer, and stay with us because Kentucky Outlook continues. Kentucky Outlook continues. We're taking a look at a post-9/11 world, and before the break we were talking with Dr. David Keeling and taking a look at the situation in Syria as we speak. So we thought it would be an excellent opportunity to learn more about Syria. We welcome to the program Huda Melki. Now Huda, many of you know, works with Western Kentucky University as our Equal Opportunity Director and wears many hats, but you also hold dual citizenship, Syrian and American.
Yes. I am American Syrian citizen. What that means, of course, I'm American. I spent majority of my life in the United States, and of course I lived in Syria, and I had my international law degree from University of Damascus. Of course I lived there too. What the dual citizenship means that when I go to Syria, all Syrian law applies to me.
Okay, you got to follow that.
And I will be treated as Syrian citizen.
As a Syrian citizen.
Of course.
And then what some people may not know about you, and what I'm hoping we get out of this segment, is a sense of Syria. Because as Dr. David Keeling talked about in the earlier segments, you know, there's a lot of, and it's not miscommunication, it's just no communication. People don't really understand, or they have a preconceived notion of what that's like. So you actually at this time have family in Syria still?
Sure. We are 7 brothers and sisters.
Oh my.
I am here in the United States. I have 1 brother in California and the rest of my family in Syria. Brothers, sisters, cousins, uncles, nieces, nephews, they're all in Damascus, the capital.
So talk a little bit about the civil war that's been going on there, and when, because you go back and visit quite frequently, or had
Yes.
done so, when you got a sense of how that was affecting what you do in your travel.
In 2011, that was my last visit. That's when I felt, when I left Damascus, I felt there is like a unrest within the younger generation who have access to social media, who they see the suppression out of the government. It's not affect them anymore, because they're seeing the world offer more and more. And therefore, you can see the movement out of the young people, and that's where I start seeing the possible opposition against the government.
Also, go back a few years before that, in 2000, you were going to run the marathon in the Olympics.
Yes.
For Syria.
Mm-hmm.
And then that changed.
That's changed. In 2000, I prepared and trained to run the marathon to represent Syria in the Olympic. However, it was a complicated situation, and I didn't get a chance to attend.
But you saw things changing as you go. But before you go there, give us a sense of your country, the country, your native country, Syria.
Of course, Syria, the oldest city in the world. Damascus, the oldest city in the world. And if you look at Syrian population, 22.4 million. And Damascus is metropolitan, 7 million in Damascus itself. And we have embassies, United Nations, businesses, trade. I mean, just like any other state, like in New York, no different than New York.
So very westernized?
Very westernized, very westernized. People travel and trade with Western countries, and you see all embassies from all westernized country in Damascus. And it's a beautiful country. People, young people are educated. We have University of Damascus, 80,000 students, and you have medical school, law school. You have all majors in University of Damascus. And of course, we have other states, Aleppo, Homs, all these states, and they're highly populated as well.
And the culture. What about, I mean, you're an amazing human being, so I would base, you know, but when we meet someone who's from Syria, what would stand out about them?
What will stand out about the people from Syria? They're westernized, they're educated, highly educated, they're very articulate, and they are socially fit with the westernized environment. And they have their religion as a basics for what they do daily.
And the religion there?
And the religion, of course, 95% Muslim. But we live with the Christian group, just like family. You have one building group coming to go to church, and the other side you will have people going to the mosque. I mean, we live very peacefully together.
Until the Civil War.
Until the Civil War. The Civil War, basically, it started with the revolution, and it took a different shape. I would say at the beginning we have opposition against the government, and that opposition changed its face 18 months ago. This opposition group, we call them the rebel, request help from United States. And United States did not help politically the rebel at that time. But what happened that this young people request help from other countries. Then when they received that help, the rebel definition really changed, and the face of the rebel changed. That means we have probably more Al-Qaeda, because we have people from Afghanistan, Pakistan fighting against the government. Because when I see video on TV, we don't have Syrian dialogue people talking. I don't see them speaking Arabic. I just don't hear the Syrian dialogue in those individuals who's fighting the government. Then who we have fighting at this point? Are we having Al-Qaeda? Are we having, who we're going to support, who we're going to believe? It would be a really tough situation.
It sounds very chaotic.
Yes, it is.
So when you talk to your family, and do you talk to them often in Syria?
I talk to my family daily.
Every day?
Every day.
So what are you hearing? I mean, you've even had some relatives kidnapped?
Yes, I have one, my niece's husband been kidnapped for 8 months, and I have a cousin got killed.
I'm so sorry.
know.
So your family is fearful, or are they going about their daily lives? Help us get a sense of that.
Well, let me give you a sense of what's going on. I know we see in the media all the war area and the killing and all that. There is pockets of Syria, of Damascus or other cities are calm and people live their daily life. However, that veneer of calmness could be destroyed by airstrike, could be destroyed by armed forces. You just don't know when that's going to happen. That means you will be going on your daily activity. You're going to your job, all of a sudden you may have a missile in front of your door. Nobody knows.
You just don't know.
You don't know.
So you've been watching with interest, I suspect, as President Obama and the international community takes a look at what to do with reports of the president of Syria using chemical weapons against his people. Do you have an opinion about that?
First of all, I'm not convinced 100% that Assad used the chemical weapon. But that's not for me to verify. United Nations hopefully will have the investigation given to the international community. Where I'm concerned, interference from United States against the chemical weapon military will be a horrific mistake. It will be a mistake in the Middle East. For the sake of American citizen and the sake of Syrian citizen. There is no way you can send one missile, pinpoint one area. You're going to kill several innocent people. That's one step. Now, with the political interference from Russia, I think we are really I'm happy that we have the political environment.
And maybe diplomacy.
Diplomacy is the key to resolve the problem. However, there is a next step. Yes, we're taking care of the chemical weapon. What's happening with the civil war in Syria? It's not only civil war, it's really Middle Eastern problem in the Middle East. So Libya, bigger. Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Iraq. There is some interference had to happen from United Nations for us, for Syria, to be able freed from that attack and that problem.
We will be watching with interest, and we'd like to get you back here maybe in a while as we see how this unfolds. Leave us with some words of wisdom.
We need to have faith that all this will be behind us and we will go back and visit Syria.
And that you'll get to go back and see your family. Good luck to you. We've been talking with Huda Milky, who is an American Syrian citizen. That's going to wrap it up for this week's edition of Kentucky Outlook. I'm Barbara Deeb. We're glad you joined us.